I will admit that, having never read the Twilight Saga nor watched any of the movies, I feel like I've skipped over a rite of passage for my generation. But from the countless hours of book reviews and movie reviews I've watched over it for some unknown reason, I know that if I ever cracked open that bad boy with the cold ones, I would have an incredibly unpleasant reading experience, because unfortunately, I have morals and therefore abusive romances marketed to the youth tend to make me a bit irritated. But I figured that, even if it suffered the same afflictions as the main books, The Short Second Life of Bree Tanner, of course by Stephanie Meyer, was simply too short to get me angry. It's only about 100 pages long, or about half the length of my aunt's crazy dissertation on male ballerinas and Appalachia. And I will say up front that this book didn't end up making me mad. There actually wasn't really any abuse in it, so that was a pleasant surprise. Now, obviously, I don't have a very high opinion of Twilight nor Meyer herself, but I will be giving this novella a fair shot and criticizing it or praising it the same way I do other books. Also, just before we get into this, I'm not really gonna talk about the plot because it's basically just Bree turns into a vampire, trains as a vampire, trains for a battle, and then has said battle, and then I talk about a little bit of what's happening, but that's basically all you need to know. So there you go. There's your plot synopsis for this one. The book is set in Bree's POV and begins with a very YA trope. Particularly, main character is annoyed with those around her because she's just so different from them. But I'm sort of offended, because here's the deal. She was annoyed with two other vampires, wondering who the best superhero would be to become a vampire, and you know what? I'm kind of into that debate. I'm putting my bets on the Hulk personally because he's already got an insane strength advantage, and then if you put the Meyer vampire powers on him, he could just rip his victim in two and open his mouth up as he fountains the blood in. Kinda like when you go outside and catch snowflakes on your tongue, but more violent and definitely a crime. Case in point, the aforementioned annoying vampire rips someone in half after flipping a car, so I think my Hulk argument is pretty solid. But hey, there's the comment bait for this video. Let me know which superhero you think would make the best Meyer vampire. Back to the story, we meet Diego, who isn't like the other vampiric boys, which makes me think he's going to be our love interest. Spoiler alert, I was right. I also think he'll be the love interest because Bree immediately says she doesn't care what he thinks about her. Already, there are just so many tropes in this, and I cannot confidently tell you whether it's because Meyer created these tropes, or because Meyer is unoriginal, because YA isn't my chosen reading material, so I don't know. Also, Bree is mentally about 15 and Diego is about 18 plus some vampire years, so that's kind of ick, even if Diego is pretty immature for his age, but I'll let someone else talk about that part. You get to decide the ages of your characters when you're writing a book, so just don't be a freak about it for no reason. On the Diego front, Bree also defies her stated character traits a lot, telling us she's closed off and very untrusting, and then in the same exact day she meets Diego, a complete stranger, she's divulging her past to him, which is so bad for her that she couldn't even remember it before. Granted, this type of hypocrisy is typical for a 15-year-old, but usually in books, these continuity errors aren't made for the sake of realism. They hit it off regardless and discuss how convenient it is that they're suddenly asking questions about their existence at the same time that the plot of this book begins. As is typical of a YA story, they fall in love right away, and it all feels very similar to how I make romances go in The Sims 4 because I'm so impatient. And because the romance feels so superficial and doesn't really matter in any way, Bree's sacrifices and blind loyalty to him later on seem baseless and not at all convincing. It really feels like the only purpose of any relationship between them at all was because Bree wouldn't have been a worthy character without a man beside her, and so when she thinks Diego dies, she can have some reason to die too, which is something Meyer is guilty of in basically every relationship she writes. That is why I feel comfortable jumping to such a harsh conclusion. Sucks to suck, I guess. Something that I enjoy in vampire fiction is realism, at least to the extent that you can manage when writing about supernatural beings. Vampires' biologies are pretty similar to humans if you go by modern standards, so I'm pretty picky about the logic in these stories as well. Bree says that humans never have enough blood in them, so I really wonder how Meyer envisions the internal biology working. Does the blood settle in their stomachs If so, the stomach can hold about 4 liters of contents, and the human body on average has almost 5 liters of blood in it. So I want to know what's going on there, because I would assume draining an adult person would get a vampire pretty full if we go on those numbers. I could understand the blood going through your system quicker when you're a new vampire for some magical reason, but it just doesn't make physical sense for her to be able to deplete 2 humans at once. Realism is what makes the unreal more threatening in my opinion, and Meyer doesn't seem to have been concerned about this issue at all, because her vamps gorge themselves a lot. So frequently to the point where I think that even if you aren't nitpicky about these things like I am, you might have thought about this once or twice. I'm also curious how her vampires walk around in normal daylight, as we know they do, when their sparkle is described as being really powerful and bright. Sunlight isn't going to mask that, especially if they're indoors like Bree and Diego were when they discovered they glitter like the setting sun. I could see a gentle glow coming off of them, but this crystal-like light show that's described is sort of impossible to see considering they supposedly go undercover, and as far as I know, humans are capable of seeing their shimmer. And Bree stresses that it's very noticeable. This is probably addressed in the main series. I'll give Meyer the benefit of the doubt here, as a lot of lore isn't explained in this novella, which is understandable. It's not a complaint, but I'm just saying these are things that confuse me, so if anyone in the comments has an answer. Also, I don't know where else to put this, but whenever the vampires running is described, I think of those TikToks where it's like POV, we're 2 ants and we look at each other when we're going to the anthill or whatever. One thing I do like, and I am curious about in a positive manner, is that the vampires have quote-unquote favorite humans based on their smells, and this causes a physical reaction in them that they can't control. I would like to know if it's some special chemical compound in their sweat, skin, hair, whatever, or maybe something in their blood in particular that makes their scent especially appealing to vampires. I know in this case it's main character syndrome, but a man can dream, and I do quite like the concept of vampires having favorite blood types, favorite human scents, etc, etc. It's a very human quality and makes the supernatural more relatable for readers, and it's just kind of quirky and fun. As well, I appreciate the realism in that the fledgling vampires have a considerably more difficult time controlling things like their strength and hunger, while older ones don't even have to think twice. Vampirism is not only a curse, but a skill that takes getting used to, and they can cause a lot of damage through not practicing self-restraint, which gives a weak point in the midst of all these newly gained superhuman powers, although they are still very OP. Another thing I like is that some of Meyer's vamps have special qualities. I especially relate to Freaky Fred because I also have a subconscious way of repelling all sentient beings within a 20-foot radius, and I do in fact use this to avoid any and all potential social interactions. People also often describe me as gross but special. 10 out of 10. No notes. In all seriousness, I did find the symbiosis between Fred and Bree funny but cute. Fred is a real one through and through. I also like that Fred wasn't a love interest to Bree at any point. Not only because I hate love triangles, and Meyer has quite enough of those in the main series, but because it's just nice to see a male character and a female character, especially in YA, just being friends. Speaking of character work, let's get on about some other characters in this novella. Raoul is a cartoon high school bully, though quite frankly the original Raoul was just as obnoxious, so maybe this chump is just a homage. Also obnoxious was Victoria, the big bad evil lady, and that description is as cartoonish as she is. Actually, all of it is extremely cartoonish. I don't know how people take this story seriously, even kids who are meant to be the audience. I much preferred the slice of life budding romance between 2 vampires who didn't really understand their existence over the latter half, which was more like an 80s superhero cartoon plotline. It just strikes me as immature writing, because I would think it's obvious that teenagers willing to pick up a book as chonky as Twilight might have a bit more of a refined reading taste than the average Saturday cartoons enjoyer. It just seems kind of insulting. A little less insulting is the premise of the plot itself, which follows a very typical YA setup. Protagonists live their lives, protags receive prophecy, prophecy has a date of battle in it, training montage, epic battle. This is common because it's a pretty easy way to make your story have stakes that are engaging to the reader. My favorite series as a kid used it, so I can't really fault Meyer for it, because when I read Percy Jackson, I was in it deep. So clearly it works for the intended audience. Reading this as an adult though, it was like reading Thomas the frickin' Tank Engine. Not to insult anyone, just whew! When I was like 14, 15, which is like the age range for this series, I think, I was reading stuff that was a bit more literary, and I don't think that was too out of the norm. And all of that may sound like a pretty amateur way to write a story, and I agree. I recently reviewed Black Christmas on my channel, and I found that its writing had this same issue. Both of these works feel as though they were written by an amateur writer. Not necessarily someone who hasn't written quite a lot of things, or doesn't know what they're doing, but someone who, regardless of how much work they've done, has never really grasped how to make a story rich. The plot itself often follows a pretty straightforward cause and effect style in these works. It's less like you're being immersed into a fictional world or a different part of the real world, and more like you're hearing about events and why they happened and then what they caused, like a history textbook. But none of it really has any meaning beyond itself, which is another hallmark of an amateur writer. Or rather than being amateurish, you could also argue that it reads like a first draft. It just feels like the ideas haven't been fully fleshed out, but the core of what the author intended to be there is there. It also feels like the author hasn't gone through and really added any symbolism or meaningful connections for the reader to make to their own lives, which is a pretty important part of writing, at least the latter half. Your stuff doesn't have to really mean anything as long as your reader can connect to it. Yes, you can write just to tell a story you have on your mind, but you're also writing for a reader when you're publishing. You want them to have something they can take away from your story and keep with them. Some little trinket that's personal to both of you, not just you as the writer who made up this world and obviously would care a lot about the characters and what's happening within it. And that's not all to say that Meyer is a bad writer in any way, or that anyone who is an amateur is a bad writer. Her work just feels incomplete and bare bones. I know a lot of people call her style purple prose or too dense or something of that nature, and often they don't think that incomplete could be a word you could describe such a style as, but personally I didn't mind her style, nor did I find it too purple prosy. It's thicker than the typical YA writing style is, and myself I like that. It's far more enjoyable for me to read than simple sentences and grammar that have little to no details or scenery and focus themselves more on efficiency than immersion. Teenagers can understand pretty dense writing, especially if they're enjoying it. In fact, I think Meyer should go all in on the purple prose, because her style is sort of a medium between the two extremes, and I think it would benefit from being denser, based on how she writes already. I have a similar style to Meyer myself as far as syntax and all goes, which makes sense because I believe Meyer finds a lot of inspiration from classical literature, and so do I. Although she does reference Shakespeare, and I cannot stand Shakespeare, so don't get that twisted. It's all to say that I understand her writing and where it's coming from, and I don't think she's necessarily bad at it, just, I don't know, not millions of dollars good at it considering our styles are comparable and I'm just some schmuck with no published work and very little work ethic. The ending of this novella is the weakest part of it all. Bree ends up without any information about what's going on for quite a while, like has her eyes closed and cannot see what's happening, and it becomes a mess of auditory details and inner thoughts that's not very interesting for the reader. Most of the anticipation I felt during that scene was for the thing to finally be over, and then it was over and it was so incredibly disappointing. Not only did the main character die in an unsatisfactory way that made the entire 3 hours I spent listening to this book feel useless, it was also completely avoidable. If Bree had told the Collins that she had a friend waiting for her in Vancouver before she eventually thought it at Alice, then they probably would have let her just go to him, since her main character Aura convinced them she was harmless and should be let go anyways. It's not like Bree was a huge character in the main series, so what would have been the harm? Wouldn't it have made the Collins look even better than letting her live until the Vittori came and killed her? I'm sure the reason here is just because Meyer wrote the main series, killed her off there, and then went about her way, and then she came back and she was like, I want to write about this vampire. And then she made up this story where the end didn't necessarily go well with what she had already written and published, but it was just too late to change it, which I've definitely ran into issues like that before, so I totally get it. It's just kind of a bad coincidence that happens sometimes. All of that said, I guess the short life of Bree Tanner was fine. I don't know. I didn't feel any particular way about it, honestly. Besides realizing that Meyer's writing isn't the worst part of her books, it's a subject matter and how she handles it. So So I will be avoiding her work now that I've gotten my dose of it, but that dose of it wasn't too awful. And I'm still glad everyone hates her nowadays for being a straight up misogynist. Just watch any of Elise Yeezy's review of the Twilight franchise if you don't want to read it or don't understand what I mean in my criticisms. They are far more entertaining and informational. I will end this review by saying that, as I've probably said before in my channel, being just fine and not inspiring any particular emotion is not exactly a good thing. It means the work was too boring for me to feel any particular way about it, and that is never good. Is it a bad book? Not necessarily. Nothing about it was particularly offensive. It was very simple. It was very quick to read. If you like Twilight, you're going to like it, but if you don't like Twilight, and maybe even if you do like Twilight and you don't really care about very minor characters, it's probably not going to spark any kind of joy for you. You know what Marie Kondo says about that. But let me know your thoughts on this novella if you've read it. Remember to like or dislike this video accordingly. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see some more book reviews, movie reviews, music discussion. I make basically whatever I feel like, but it's usually within those three categories.